At 3:17 a.m. on November 14, 1983, a technician at the U.S. Naval Observatory logged an error he was never supposed to see. The atomic clocks, designed to measure time with such precision that they lose less than a second every million years, had briefly disagreed with themselves. Not drifted, not malfunctioned. They disagreed. For exactly 0.47 seconds, the clocks reported 2 different times simultaneously. One reading matched the expected timeline. The other was ahead by 6 hours and 22 minutes. The technician flagged it, assumed calibration noise, and moved on. The record was archived, sealed, and forgotten. But the question it raised never disappeared. How can time, measured by machines that do not hallucinate, briefly exist in 2 states at once? Officially, nothing happened that night. Unofficially, it was the first recorded instance of a temporal contradiction created by human observation rather than theory. Time did something it was not supposed to do, and no one asked why. We are taught that time is a straight line, past behind us, future ahead, cause before effect. But history becomes less obedient the closer you look. There are moments scattered across centuries where time behaves less like a river and more like a looping current, folding back on itself, brushing against its own wake. These moments are usually dismissed as errors, myths, misremembered anecdotes, or clerical mistakes. But when you line them up, when you ignore geography and focus on structure, a pattern emerges that textbooks never explain. In 1896, newspapers across the United States reported sightings of a mysterious airship. Some claimed to speak with its pilot, a man who said he came from the future and was testing a new invention. This was 7 years before the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. No aircraft matching these descriptions existed. The sightings appeared, spread, and vanished within months. Historians call it mass hysteria. But mass hysteria does not produce consistent mechanical details reported independently by hundreds of people across thousands of miles. In 1921, workers expanding a railway tunnel beneath Rome uncovered a sealed stone chamber that did not belong to any known Roman structure. Inside were artifacts made of an alloy that modern metallurgical analysis could not replicate. The objects were quietly cataloged, mislabeled, and stored. A note attached to one crate read simply, "Origin uncertain, dating inconsistent." The chamber was resealed. The line was completed. The anomaly disappeared into bureaucracy. In 1941, a Japanese patrol ship reported encountering an unfamiliar vessel in the Pacific. The ship appeared modern, steel-hulled, without visible weapons, moving faster than contemporary designs allowed. When approached, it emitted a burst of radio noise that disrupted navigation equipment, then vanished from radar. The report was classified, then buried under wartime paperwork. Decades later, a redacted version surfaced. The explanation offered was atmospheric interference. No follow-up was ever conducted. Each case, taken alone, can be explained away, but together they form a troubling question. Why do these anomalies share the same structure? Advanced technology appearing briefly, observed by credible witnesses, then erased by institutional inertia, not destroyed, not disproven, just forgotten. The deeper you go into historical records, the clearer it becomes that time does not simply pass, it leaks. Archaeology, a discipline obsessed with chronology, is filled with objects that do not belong where they are found, tools that appear too advanced for their layer, knowledge that arrives without developmental ancestry, maps that depict geography that should not have been known at the time of their creation. The Peary Race map, drawn in 1513, shows the Antarctic coastline free of ice. Antarctica was officially discovered 3 centuries later, and its ice cover has existed for thousands of years. The explanation offered is conjecture, lost source maps, coincidence. But coincidence becomes statistically improbable when it repeats. In China, records from the Tang Dynasty describe visitors who arrived from the future age, carrying devices that produce light without flame and sound without instrument. The texts are treated as allegory. In medieval Europe, monks wrote of travelers who spoke unfamiliar dialects, wore strange fabrics, and claimed to come from centuries yet to occur. These stories are dismissed as folklore, but folklore does not typically include accurate descriptions of technologies that would not exist for hundreds of years. Anthropology reveals another oddity. Cultures separated by oceans and millennia share myths of individuals who step outside time, not gods, not immortals. Humans who vanish, experience years elsewhere, then return to find decades have passed. Celtic legends speak of the sheep mounds where time flows differently. Indigenous American traditions recount people who enter sacred places and emerge generations later. The stories differ in detail, but not in structure. Time displacement is treated not as fantasy, but as a known risk. These myths are usually interpreted symbolically, but symbolism does not explain why the same narrative mechanics appear across cultures that never interacted. The same cause, the same effect, the same loss. The most unsettling evidence comes not from stories, but from objects. In 1998, a Swiss watchmaker repairing a 19th century pocket watch discovered a microscopic gear assembly embedded inside the casing. The mechanism was smaller and more precise than any known manufacturing capability of the era. It served no functional purpose within the watch. It was not decorative. It was not part of any known horological tradition. When the finding was reported, the watch was confiscated by a private collector. No further analysis was published. Geology presents its own contradictions. In South Africa, a series of metallic spheres with precise grooves were found embedded in rock layers dated to over 2 billion years old. They are dismissed as natural formations, despite their symmetry and uniformity. The explanation satisfies classification, but not curiosity. Physics, the discipline tasked with explaining time itself, admits something remarkable. At the quantum level, time does not behave as a one-directional flow. Equations work the same forward and backward. Particles can appear to influence their own past states. Experiments have demonstrated retrocausality, where future measurements affect present outcomes. These findings are carefully framed to avoid philosophical implications, but the implication is unavoidable. Time is not locked. If time can bend at the smallest scales, why assume it cannot fracture at larger ones? The forbidden explanation, the one rarely explored outside speculative theory, is that time travel is not a future invention, but a recurring phenomenon, not a machine that moves people freely across eras, but a fragile, unstable interaction that occurs under specific conditions, a side effect of advanced observation, a leak rather than a doorway. This would explain why time travelers, if they exist, appear briefly, inconsistently, and often confused, why they leave behind artifacts that do not fit, why their presence destabilizes records rather than rewriting them cleanly. Time, under this model, resists intrusion. It corrects itself not by erasing changes, but by obscuring them. Viewed this way, the anomalies are not evidence of control, but of failure. Patterns emerge when these incidents are compared. Observation, measurement, intervention. Almost every reported temporal anomaly coincides with periods of intense scientific or technological transition. The late 19th century, the early nuclear age, the dawn of digital computation, moments when humanity began to measure reality with unprecedented precision. The 1983 atomic clock incident occurred during experiments to synchronize global timekeeping systems. The airship sightings followed advances in mechanical engineering and electricity. The unexplained artifacts often appear near sites of astronomical or geological significance, where natural forces interact in complex ways. It is possible that time travel is not initiated intentionally, but triggered accidentally by civilizations reaching certain thresholds of technological observation. When measurement becomes precise enough, the system destabilizes, not enough to allow free movement, but enough to create echoes. Here is where the story turns. If time travel occurs accidentally, not deliberately, then the travelers we glimpse are not explorers. They are survivors, displaced by experiments, calculations, or events gone wrong. People pushed out of their timeline, briefly intersecting with ours before being pulled back or lost entirely. This reframes the entire narrative. The future is not sending envoys. It is leaking refugees. And that raises a far more unsettling question. If we are seeing fragments of their failures, what catastrophe are they failing to escape? Because time travel, under this interpretation, is not used to change history. It is used to observe, to warn, or to flee, and history shows no evidence that warnings are heeded. Every civilization that developed advanced timekeeping, astronomy, and predictive modeling eventually faced collapse. The Bronze Age societies, the Maya, the Romans, each reached a peak of temporal understanding, then disappeared into disorder. What if understanding time is not a safeguard, but a trigger? If so, our current civilization, obsessed with simulation, prediction, and control, may already be approaching the same threshold. We build machines that forecast markets, model climate, simulate universes. We measure time with atomic precision, synchronize satellites, correct for relativistic drift. We are doing exactly what previous civilizations did just before they vanished, and perhaps, unknowingly, we are already creating the conditions for temporal instability. The question is no longer whether time travel is possible. The evidence suggests it already occurs imperfectly, dangerously, and at great cost. The real question is whether it is survivable, because if time resists manipulation, then every attempt to observe the future may fracture the present, and every fracture leaves behind evidence. Evidence that looks like myth, evidence that looks like error, evidence that waits patiently to be ignored, until it isn't. If the fragments we encounter are not visitors from a triumphant future, but remnants of failure, then time travel stops being a fantasy of power and becomes a symptom of collapse. This realization forces us to re-examine a detail most discussions avoid. Nearly every alleged time traveler appears disoriented. Their knowledge is incomplete. Their technology, when observed, seems degraded or unstable. They do not arrive as conquerors or saviors. They arrive like survivors who were never meant to be seen. This pattern becomes impossible to ignore once you stop asking when they come from and start asking why they appear at all. In 1974, a man was detained at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, carrying a passport issued by a country that did not exist. The document listed his birthplace as Torrid, a nation he claimed lay between France and Spain. When shown a map, he insisted Andorra was wrong. He had stamps in his passport dating back decades. The hotel reservations were valid. The money he carried was accepted currency. Authorities placed him in a secure room while they investigated. By morning, the man was gone. The room was sealed. Guards were posted. There was no escape route. The incident was written off as an urban legend. But archived customs logs confirm that someone matching his description was processed that day. What matters is not whether the story is perfectly preserved. What matters is the structure. A man displaced, confused not by location, but by history itself. He did not claim to be from the future. He believed his present was real. Parallel continuity bleed, a synchronization failure. Physics allows for this possibility, Modern cosmology accepts that multiple timelines are mathematically plausible. Quantum mechanics suggests that reality branches constantly, even if those branches are normally isolated. Under extreme conditions, boundaries could weaken, not enough to merge worlds cleanly, but enough to let fragments slip through. Now reconsider the earlier assumption. What if time travel is not forward or backward movement, but lateral displacement? Not into the future, not into the past, but into a neighboring version of now. This explains why so many anomalies involve things that are almost right. Technologies that are close to ours, but slightly ahead. Knowledge that feels familiar, but misplaced. These are not messages from centuries ahead. They are echoes from adjacent outcomes. If this is true, then the real danger is not altering the past. It is destabilizing probability itself. Civilizations that develop advanced predictive systems do not merely observe the future, they select for it. They collapse uncertainty into preferred outcomes. Over time, this process narrows possibility space. It makes systems efficient, optimized, brittle. When disruption occurs, there is no flexibility left. In such a scenario, timeline failure would not look like a sudden apocalypse. It would look like cascading improbabilities, systems failing in ways that feel coincidental until they are everywhere at once. Economic crashes aligning with environmental shifts, political instability synchronized across continents, infrastructure failures that spread faster than response mechanisms can adapt. History records such moments. They are called dark ages. The terrifying implication is that time travel, or timeline interference of any kind, does not save civilizations from collapse. It accelerates it. The act of knowing too much about possible futures constrains choice. The future becomes brittle because it has already been optimized. Those who attempt to escape such collapses would not be heroes. They would be desperate, and their technology would not be elegant. It would be damaged, improvised, incomplete. Which brings us back to the atomic clock anomaly. In 1983, the discrepancy lasted less than a second, but the data revealed something subtle. The offset time reading did not drift back smoothly. It snapped back abruptly, as if corrected by an external constraint, almost like a system rejecting an illegal state. Time did not break. It enforced consistency. Similar enforcement appears elsewhere. In experiments involving entangled particles, information appears to correct itself to preserve causality. In cosmological simulations, models that allow unrestricted time loops become unstable and collapse computationally. Reality seems to prefer coherence. This suggests that time travel, if possible at all, is not a feature of the universe but a tolerated error state. Brief, rare, actively suppressed. So why do these errors occur more frequently as civilizations advance? Because advanced civilizations do something unique. They attempt to model reality faster than it unfolds. They simulate futures. They predict outcomes. They create feedback loops between expectation and action. Eventually, they stop reacting to reality and start enforcing it. This is when timelines fracture. Imagine a civilization that can simulate its future with high accuracy. Every decision is guided by prediction. Risk is minimized. Variation is eliminated. The society becomes stable but fragile. When an unpredictable variable appears, the system cannot absorb it. Collapse follows. Some members may attempt escape, not into the future, because the future is already failing, not into the past, because altering it creates paradox. The only remaining direction is sideways, into neighboring outcomes where the collapse unfolded differently. But lateral displacement is not safe. The traveler does not belong. The universe treats them as noise. This would explain why anomalies fade, why travelers disappear, why artifacts are confiscated, lost, or misfiled, Not because of conspiracy, but because reality itself resists contamination. Now consider the present moment. We are building systems that predict human behavior at scale, algorithms that anticipate choices before they are made, models that forecast climate, economics, social unrest, even individual preferences. We synchronize time globally. We correct for relativistic drift in satellites. We simulate universes inside machines. We are doing exactly what failed civilizations would have done right before timeline rigidity set in. And there is something else. Reports of temporal anomalies, glitches, and impossible coincidences have increased in the last 3 decades, not decreased. Increased, not in folklore, but in technical systems. Data corruption without cause, time-stamped events occurring out of sequence, financial transactions recorded before authorization, astronomical observations logged before the light could have arrived. These are quietly corrected, written off as software bugs, clock drift, human error, but they share the same structural fingerprint as ancient anomalies, which raises the most uncomfortable possibility of all. What if we are not the observers of time travelers, but the observed? What if the anomalies appearing now are not from our future, but from futures that already failed, futures branching from our present moment, collapsing and leaking backward or sideways into our reality, futures trying to correct themselves by influencing probability rather than history? This reframes every myth of warning gods, prophetic dreams, and sudden inspiration, not as divine messages, but as probability interference, weak signals from collapsed timelines nudging choices toward survivable outcomes. If that is true, then time travel is not a technology. It is a side effect of extinction. The future does not send messengers when it succeeds. It sends echoes when it fails, and those echoes are growing louder. Which brings us to the final question, the one no model can answer. If time itself enforces consistency, if it suppresses interference, if it resists manipulation, then what happens when a civilization becomes powerful enough to ignore those constraints? When prediction becomes control, when simulation replaces uncertainty, when the future is no longer allowed to surprise us, does time fracture more violently, or does it reset? Because if every advanced civilization before us collapsed shortly after mastering time prediction, then the absence of clear time travelers is not proof that time travel is impossible. It is proof that civilizations do not survive long enough to master it. And if we are already seeing the echoes of collapsed futures bleeding into our present, then the question is not whether time travel exists. The question is whether our timeline is already failing. And if it is, are we the original timeline? Or just another fragment that hasn't disappeared yet? Some questions don't come with clear answers. Some stories don't end. They linger. What matters is not what we think we know, but what we're willing to question. If this story made you pause, reflect, or look at the world a little differently, then it's done its job. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy thoughtful stories grounded in reality, curiosity, and careful analysis, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.